As a generation, I think we have had way too many times how most of our problems are related to our thought patterns and mindsets. Life is not about what happens, it's how you react to it, they said. You can only control how you respond, they added. And this all feels sucky because what the fuck does it even mean? If you have struggles with these shift your mindset type of conversations, I have found a simple explanation on how some of your thoughts can be a problem. But first, welcome to this episode of Between Me and the Ink. I do hope you've been keeping well and that the year is being kind to you so far. Our thoughts often end up dictating how we feel. However, we can also influence the thoughts that we have. The human gift of metacognition means that you have the capacity to think about your thoughts, to process them, and then decide how you want to respond to them. This means that instead of living on autopilot and allowing every thought to overwhelm and disorient you, you can actually develop a muscle for filtering the thoughts that you then allow to impact your feelings and actions. Different people have different processes for this, and I will recommend making a habit of noticing and debunking your cognitive distortions. Simply put, cognitive distortions are the biased thoughts that put you in a negative thought loop. They are filters or biases that limit your ability to fully and objectively process an experience. When you think about it, these distortions are like shortcuts that your brain takes when it doesn't want to read the full text, like a SparkNotes that is likely full of erroneous conclusions. In critical thinking, we have logical fallacies that can undermine your argument because they are either illogical or irrelevant. Similarly, when you evaluate cognitive distortions, you'll find that there are flaws in perspective that make the drawn conclusions fall short, thus making it likely that your reaction to that thought will be counterproductive. So far, I have come across about 15 cognitive distortions, but many of them are somewhat similar in the way that they can be handled. Also, each cognitive distortion can be handled with just the awareness of their onset. So I'll preface this episode by saying that mindfulness is a mandatory component in dealing with cognitive distortions. And it is not that your brain is purposefully trying to mislead you. Rather, over the years, you've probably had some bad experiences that caused your brain to make the wrong connections. These connections affect how your brain perceives certain experiences and the associations that it makes. And sometimes you are consciously aware that an association is wrong, but your brain still makes it, leaving you misguided by your subconscious mind. For example, my body gets very anxious when I'm about to travel because of a bad association that I had with traveling as a child. I have taken so many happy trips as an adult, but my brain still distorts that association and makes traveling generally rough. The good news is that you can rewire your brain by consciously deconstructing those distortions and consistently making new associations. Like for most of my early adulthood, I decided that I hated traveling and would really try my best to avoid it. But I now know that the only way to get rid of the bad associations is by consistently giving my brain new ones, which is why I am now comfortable going on as many fun trips as I can with my loved ones. Similarly, when you know what distortion you're dealing with, it gets easier to disarm it. I'll start with my least favorite cognitive distortion, which is overgeneralization. As the name suggests, this is when you use one occurrence to define something larger, like your life, your work, or your relationships. For example, if you hate making phone calls and you get on a project that requires some correspondence, you suddenly conclude that you hate your job because it requires you to call people. In reality, if you loved the work before, you probably still love it, right? You can dislike something about your work and still have an incredible time doing the work. Within relationships, this often feels like deciding that the relationship is not working or that your partner is terrible just because you had a disagreement. And yet on many other aspects, you all are still on the same page. I get having deal breakers and responding to red flags, but surely you can't objectively decide that a whole relationship is bad based on one disagreement. A more common example here is thinking that you're a failure when something you've been working on doesn't seem to pan out. Objectively, you might find that there are many other things that you are successful in, but at that moment, your brain is hyper-focused on the one thing that is not turning out well for you. The most obvious solution to this distortion is to look at all the ways that one negative incident can be avoided in the future. For example, if your negative distortion is that you are bad at relationships and should stay single, you can start by finding out why you are bad at relationships and work on fixing whatever the problem is. The idea here is that even though the said event is in fact negative, it does not have to be a predictor for the rest of your life. You can get better at anything if you commit the time to learn and practice. So while it can be a fact that you sucked at your last relationship, that is not an identity thing. Future you might actually make the best partner if you decide to work on the areas that have generated the negative outcomes for you in the past. This same concept applies to business. Find out why your previous venture didn't work out and do better for the next one. You can't just say that you're bad at running a business. You just need to put in more work, maybe do some market research, maybe put in more time, maybe develop your product better and make more sales pitches, maybe network more and get more people to see what you're selling or making. When you think about it objectively, a negative outcome can have very logical reasons, and once you address those reasons, you stand a chance at getting a positive outcome. When you find yourself overgeneralizing, pull out your phone, laptop, or journal and write out the facts. This will help you to remember that it is just one, possibly tiny incident against a reality where the possibilities tend to remain infinite. Polarized thinking is where you think in black and white, like for you everything is one thing or the other and there's no in between. For example, you think so highly of someone and then they do one bad thing and you suddenly think they are the worst person to ever exist. And this happens a lot on social media or with celebrities, where no one wants to know anything beyond their own very limited judgments. If you genuinely have no middle ground, no contextual considerations, no grace, no nothing, your relationship with yourself and with others can become very stressful, with you faking perfection and hiding your true self in the search for acceptance, while also forcing those close to you into the tiny neat boxes that you've built with this kind of thinking. Like I said earlier, I do get having non-negotiables and things that you just can't look past. Personally, I think perpetrating or enabling any form of sexual violence is hard to negotiate. But if you generally think in absolutes, you'll have to contend with a lot of cognitive dissonance. No one is absolutely one way or the other, and you learn this very fast when you honestly look at your life. You can generally be a good person and still do some bad things without necessarily becoming a bad person. Just like bad people also do good things, and that doesn't make them any good. Depending on your moral compass, good and bad can and often do exist together. While there can be a stark difference between good and bad, there is a lot of gray areas between the two, and you don't jump from one extreme to the other. Most people actually fall within that gray area where sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. And this applies to almost every aspect of life. I can be really good at listening and be really bad at sharing my thoughts and feelings. Does that make me a good communicator or a bad communicator? If I am very good at one thing and very bad at the other, I think the fair analysis would put me in the middle as an average communicator. Polarized thinking would have you deciding that if I'm not getting 100%, then I must be bad at it. But life likes to exist in balance. In the episode on crappy days, I asked if a bad day can become a good day if something good happens later in the day. I think that just like days, people can have both good and bad aspects to them. It is also important to note that polarized thinking not only gets you to set impossible standards for yourself, but also makes it so easy for you to give up on yourself and your dreams. For example, if you decide to start working out and then you miss a workout or a whole week of workouts, polarized thinking is deciding that you have failed. A safer and more accurate middle ground will have you considering that maybe you didn't work out because you had a tough week, but if you try again, you might do better. Get comfortable with duality because you can be bad at one thing and good at another, instead of wanting to be good or bad at everything. Mind reading is a cognitive distortion that entails making assumptions about what someone else is thinking or feeling. If you're hypervigilant, this is probably your biggest problem because it gets amplified by your past experiences. Mind reading can show up as you seeing a vile post on your friend's social media and assuming that it is about you and that they are somewhat mad at you or they hate you. When you notice yourself mind reading, question each assumption and seek out some evidence. Did your friend ignore your calls or something? Did you all have an argument? Have they told you that they're mad? What makes you so sure that that post was about you? The more you question the assumption, the more you realize that you don't know shit about facts, and that's a good thing. I think catastrophizing and personalizing are also similar to mind reading because they involve jumping to conclusions without really considering the facts. Catastrophizing involves jumping to the worst possible conclusion without stopping to look at the available evidence. And it usually comes with what-if questions, like, what if my alarm does not go off and I wake up late and miss my flight? Na saizi hata bado haujabook flight. Catastrophizing just amps your anxiety for sport, and the best way to beat it is by being objective. If you miss a flight, you can always take the next one. If you wake up late often, you can avoid morning flights. When you think objectively, Nothing needs to be a catastrophe. On the other hand, personalization is when you decide that you are responsible for everything that happens. I once had a friend claiming responsibility over another friend getting into an accident because she gave her car for the weekend. Like, how is it your fault that someone else was drunk driving and got into an accident while you were at home? This distortion makes you find ways to blame yourself in situations where you had minimal involvement. I see this with mothers when their children get hurt, whether by accident or by heartless people. Like, yes, you may have a responsibility to prevent shit from happening, but it is not your fault unless you tangibly contributed to that shit. Another aspect of personalization is when you decide that everything has to be about you. Like when you see someone talking about parenting and you take it as a judgment against how you parent, and yet that person is not even aware of your parenting style. This happens a lot on social media, where people feel compelled to start arguments where one person was simply expressing their opinion, but the reactions become overly emotional. To counter this distortion, think about how many degrees of separation there are between you and the issue in question. For example, on the post about parenting, the first degree is that this person is not your child or your partner, so they really have no idea how you run your household. The second is that you do not know them enough to know what compelled them to share the said opinion. The third is that they have no bearing over how you parent your children, so their opinion does not in any way affect your parenting. And there are often many more reasons to distance yourself from personalizing an experience that has nothing to do with you. Another distortion related to mind reading is fortune telling, where you decide that you have enough knowledge to predict the future. And this comes a lot with underlying anxiety disorders. The truth is, you have no idea what tomorrow is going to look like. So like in mind reading, once you find yourself fortune telling, you need to seek out the evidence. In most times, you will just realize that you do not have enough information to back your predictions, and that like most people, you really can't predict shit. And this applies even to people who like to say that when they think of bad things, they tend to come true. There may have been some incidents in the past where this was actually accurate, because even a broken clock is right twice a day. But you need a more objective calculation for how many of your predictions actually come true. Because babe, if all it took for bad things to happen is for them to show up in your thoughts, the world would probably not still be standing. Remind yourself that your feelings of dread are not as justifiable as they want you to make them. Emotional reasoning is when you decide that your feelings are facts. Have you ever had someone come at you claiming that you've done something because apparently they just know it? There are times when your gut will be right, based on signs that you've correctly interpreted from your past experiences. But for the rest of the time, your feelings are not facts. Feelings change based on your thoughts, and they can change just as easily when you learn the facts. Like, I can be feeling rejected when my partner does not return my calls all day, but when I get to know why, the feelings of rejection subside. If I react to the initial feelings, I end up feeling dumb once I get the facts of the situation. So, to deal with this distortion, you simply have to question whether you are responding to the facts or the feelings. You can accept what you're feeling in the moment without allowing those feelings to make you do things that you'll regret when the facts come into play. Egocentric thinking is in the same category with emotional reasoning, because you will be using your own values and perspectives to judge another person's behavior without considering that they have their own values and perspectives to go by. With egocentric reasoning, I think the best solution I can offer is that meme that says the best thing about me is that I'm not you. Remember to see people as complete beings in and of themselves, and that they have different experiences and contexts that you probably do not know about. Another really common cognitive distortion is filtering, which involves focusing on negative thoughts even when there is evidence of positive things happening. Filtering keeps you from seeing anything good even when it's right in front of you. For example, if you do relationship reviews, which I recommend you do regularly, and your partner says 5 things that have been going well in that relationship, but at the end of it you feel shitty because they complained about one thing that they'd like you to do better, you're neck deep into the filtering. This also applies at work. If your colleagues commend you for doing a good job and then they cite an area that you need to pay more attention to, then you start feeling pissy about it, just pump your brakes. What can help in such an instance is to remind yourself of all the positive things. Another filter that is similar to this one is discounting the positive. You can be fully aware of all the good that has happened, but you think it is not important. Like when someone compliments you, you assume they're just being nice, but if they were to say bad things about you, you'd not assume that they're just being mean. Discounting the positive is insidious because you may never notice until you start paying attention. When you find yourself doing it, stop for a minute and acknowledge that you are wrong. It doesn't matter if someone is just being nice. A compliment is a compliment is a compliment. Just fucking take it. Musts and shoulds involve having unrealistic expectations that only set you up to fail. And for the most part, you may not even know where you got the idea that you must or you should. A common example that comes to mind is when you think that an independent woman should never ask for help. Like, who said that? And why do you take their word for it? Or if you think that you should eat 5 times a day, like, why? What if you're not hungry? What are you hoping to achieve from all that eating? The remedy here is to question all the shoulds that you find yourself telling yourself and trying to live up to, and make sure that you agree with them and are not just blindly enforcing subconscious rules that don't even serve you. Like people who force themselves to get up early when they don't have an early morning. If you're a morning person, that's fine. But if you're a night owl with a 6 a.m. alarm on a day that you're gonna be at home chilling all day, then like, why? Why do you think you must wake up early every day when it clearly doesn't serve you? When you are examining the rules that you set for yourself, figure out the why, and then if it makes sense, replace the must or should with prefer. So you can say, I prefer to not ask for help, or I prefer to eat 5 times a day, or I prefer to wake up at 6 a.m. every day. You can have preferences even if they don't serve you. That's your struggle bus to board if you want. The always being right distortion involves you maintaining an argument even when there is glaring evidence that you are wrong. When this happens, you often start deviating from the issue at hand and start getting personal and even attacking the other party. I think that when you find yourself feeling like you have to be right, even when you can see that you are wrong, you just need to remember that you're allowed to be wrong too. Take that L with your head held high because you deserve the same grace as everyone else. And we all make mistakes and get things wrong every now and then. Labeling is similar to overgeneralization, except that it often applies to people and things. Like if someone is late to one meeting and you decide that they are tardy, or if someone has to take a rain check and you start calling them flaky. This distortion isolates you because you are quick to write people off over one misstep. Pull back and consider offering grace to yourself first, because labeling others like this is a reflection of how harsh you are with yourself. Blaming, on the other hand, is being quick to assign others responsibility over how you are feeling. And this happens a lot, by the way. Someone can say they don't like the dress you're wearing and you feel bad about it for the rest of the day. But if they don't like your dress, did you want them to lie? I don't think they had to tell you unless you asked. But do they have to like everything that you wear? If you like the dress enough, their thoughts on it won't matter. So essentially, when you interrogate the situation, you might find that you're not really upset about their comment on the dress. It could be that you're disappointed because you really wanted them to like the dress, and that's on you. Or maybe you doubt your sense of style. Don't be too quick to decide that someone else is responsible for how you're feeling. Rather, deconstruct the whole situation and find out which part is getting to you and why. The last category of cognitive distortions are called fallacies, and they include the control fallacy, the fairness fallacy, the change fallacy, and the reward fallacy. The control fallacy is when you either think you are fully in control of your life or you have no control whatsoever. Like let's say you have a deadline that you don't meet, and instead of taking responsibility, you find other people to blame. Maybe your partner forgot to load the token so you had no lights last night, and your neighbor packed you in so you couldn't drive to a coffee shop to work. And your boss hasn't paid you, so you have no money to buy the tokens yourself. In reality, you could have full lizard, you could have walked, you could have done the work earlier. Like you had other alternatives that you are refusing to acknowledge, and instead you're blaming everyone else for your failure. The other side would appear when you are late for an event because there was an accident that kept you in traffic for 3 hours. Here, you find yourself thinking that if you had left earlier, you'd have gotten there in time. While in reality, you couldn't have known that there would have been an accident or that it would take that long to clear the road and allow the traffic to move faster. In either case, you just need to be objective and deconstruct your thoughts with the consideration that you are human, capable of mistakes, and with only so much power. The fairness fallacy is when you have a mental roster of what you consider fair and expect everyone to share the same idea like a universal constitution or something. For example, some people believe that if they make you dinner, you have to do the dishes. But I hate doing dishes, so unless we have a pre-existing agreement, it is very unlikely that I will just get up and do dishes in another person's house. So if you feel resentment when someone does not act according to your idea of fairness, the first thing to ask is whether you communicated your expectations or not. Because fairness is a very subjective concept and it is usually very self-serving, because if you ask me, cooking is fun but doing dishes is not. And if I was involved in that decision making, I would gladly make you the dinner so that you can do the dishes. Instead of expecting fairness, communicate your expectations beforehand to avoid feeling resentment when the other party is fully unaware of what you want them to do for you. Communicating will also allow the other party to negotiate and avoid being blindsided when you complain that they have been unfair. The change fallacy is where you imagine that you can pressure someone into changing in a way that suits your desires. For example, if you start dating and decide that you want your partner to change and maybe stop posting certain things or wearing certain things or going to certain places, the truth is that that person does not owe you any change. They might adjust their life to accommodate your needs, but that will have to be a choice that they make. No amount of pressure from your end can make someone change to suit you. So when you find yourself pressuring someone to change themselves for you, just remember that that's not how life works. Also, consider that the person changing won't necessarily make you happy. Because for it to balance, if they give up something that is important to them, they'll make you give up something that is important to you in one way or another. And that ends in resentment and lost individuality. The reward fallacy is where you think that if you sacrifice enough or work hard enough, you're owed a reward in the end. The problem with this is that you end up expecting things to magically work out for you, and when they don't, you either become angry and frustrated or completely lose motivation. I think that the best way to counter this fallacy is by changing your why. Don't do the right thing because you expect some magical reward. Do it because you want to, because it's just who you are. That way you don't imagine that the universe owes you, and any magical wins that come your way will just be affirmations. Okay, this has been way too long for me, but thank you for sticking to the very end. When it comes to cognitive distortions, I don't think there can be any finality in the way you tackle them. I think the real win is maintaining enough mindfulness to notice them when they show up, so that you can course correct in real time. And if you notice them after the fact, remember to give yourself all the grace. Knowing better does not always translate to doing better. For the rest of the week, I wish you love, compassion, and lots of grace, both for yourself and for others.